Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. In this video, we're going to be speaking about 7 principles of vocabulary learning. So these are 7 key points which will aid you in learning the vocabulary of your target language. So regardless of what the language may be that you're trying to learn, by understanding these 7 key points, it should help you, inshallah, in learning the vocabulary of that language and better understanding how the importance of vocabulary, how to learn vocabulary, and also how to consolidate and to memorize vocabulary in that target language you're trying to understand. So inshallah, these points will aid you in better understanding vocabulary acquisition. So the first point I want to talk about is that vocabulary is the most important aspect of learning a language. So the most important thing when it comes to learning a language is really the vocabulary and you mastering it and you having a very big and a very broad understanding of vocabulary and how to use it and so on and so forth. So this is highlighted by Milo Troki and also Karen Bartle when they mentioned vocabulary or lexicon is the most important level of L2 knowledge for all learners to develop. So they clearly mention the 2 specialists in the field of SLE that the most important aspect of learning a language is pretty much the most important knowledge of learning a language that's part of a language and part of learning a language is vocabulary and you acquiring it and you having a good understanding of that vocabulary. Likewise, Wilkins states, while without grammar, very little can be conveyed, without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. So if someone just knows a few words in a language, he's still going to be able to, inshallah, and if he's a tourist or if he's a visitor to a country, if he knows a few words, he'll be able to express himself or she'll be able to express herself in a certain sense, to a certain level. But if someone does not know any vocabulary, even if he has mastered the grammar of a language, he'll not be even able to express something as simple as, where's the store? If he has absolutely no vocabulary and a knowledge of that language. So vocabulary is the most important aspect of learning a language. It's the aspect that you should focus on specifically at the beginning. And we're going to see that focusing on vocabulary is much more broad than simply memorizing a list of words, as we're going to see in the other points. So vocabulary in the most broadest sense of the term is the thing that you should be focusing on from the very beginning of learning a language for a multitude of reasons. From them is because it is the aspect of learning a language which is continuous. Regardless of whether it's your native tongue or whether it's a second language or a third language, we're constantly learning new words. Me as a native French speaker, I'm constantly learning new French words. I'm constantly learning new English words. And whatever native tongue that you may speak, likewise in that native tongue, you're never free of learning, or you never not need to learn new words in that language. So vocabulary is a very long process, or vocabulary acquisition in a language is a very long process, and it's an endless process. The sooner you begin it, the easier it's going to be when it comes to trying to express yourself or trying to read in that language. So that's the first point. The second point is vocabulary means more than just words. So vocabulary is the words of a language, including single items and phrases or chunks of several words that convey a particular meaning the way individual words do. This is according to Coxhead, who mentions that vocabulary in reality is much more broad than just simple single words like car, house, man, woman, and so on and so forth. But rather, when we say vocabulary, when it comes to second language acquisition and learning a new language, it also includes phrases, formulaic phrases, or phrasal verbs. So these chunks of words that come together to create one idea. In other words, when an English speaker says in other words is a complete idea. It's a complete meaning that if I was to separate one word from that structure, it would change the meaning. So if I said in other, it doesn't mean the same thing as in other words. And in other words is used as a native speaker, as an English speaker, as a fluent English speaker, as one idea. And we do this all the time. The sum of it, in other words, sort of, and these other types of phrases that we use as if it was one idea. So when you're learning a language, it's important that you don't only focus on learning singular words, car, house, man, woman, but you also focus on learning the equivalent of the formulaic phrases that you have in your tongue. So in other words, sort of, the sum of it, and so on and so forth. So that's the second point. So make sure that you also understand this. The third point is that words should not be learned in isolation. Words should not be learned in isolation. So just taking a list of words and knowing that, for example, Bayt means house, Sayara means car, Masjid means masjid, and the list goes on, that's not the best way to learn vocabulary, especially when you go to more advanced words. But rather, you should try to learn words in its context as we're going to cover. So the reason, or one of the two reasons why you should never learn words in isolation is because words do not always have an exact equivalent in other language. That's one point. Words do not always have an equivalent in other languages. So for example, in Arabic, the word faja'a means something along the lines of you making somebody else lose something that's cherished to him or her. Something along the lines of you making somebody else lose something that is very dear to that person. So say, for example, فَجَعَهُ فِي أَهْلِهِ or فَجَعَهُ فِي مَالِهِ. He made him lose something dear to him that had to do with his family, a close family member of him. He made him lose that close family member, or he made him lose his money. So faja'a is not something that has a direct equivalent in English. So when you're trying to learn the word faja'a in Arabic, you can't just try to find an exact equivalent in English and just say, okay, faja'a means to lose. You won't get the full sense of the word and you won't understand how to actually use it. So that's one point. The second reason why you should never learn words in isolation is that words usually have multiple meanings that change depending on the context. So for example, in English, we have this all the time. For example, the word present. The word present can mean a lot of different things. So I can say, for example, the present time is the best time to present the present. The word present in this one sentence had three different meanings. The present time, now it's the present in terms of the time of the present right now. The present time is the best time to present. Present can also mean to give, right? To present the present. Present can also mean a gift. So if I was to just teach the word or learn the word present to just mean the present time, and I was to read a sentence like this, or to read a sentence where the word present was used in another context, I would have a hard time understanding what's being said. You also find this in Arabic with the verb da'a. Da'a can mean to supplicate, but it can also mean just to call somebody, right? So depending on the context, da'a can mean to supplicate to Allah, but it can also mean just to call somebody or to invite somebody. And the context is what's going to determine the meaning of these words. So that's another reason why you should try to never learn words in isolation. And there's something that Wilga Rivers, who is an actual linguistics scholar at Harvard, she mentions that students often fail to realize that meaning is expressed in groups of words and in combinations of language segments, and that the meaning of an individual word is usually difficult to determine when it's separated from the context of the words and phrases, as we just covered. Students are thus unprepared to use the words they have learned as isolated units in any approximation to authentic communication. So the reason why a lot of us have difficulty speaking in a second language, whether it be Arabic or French or whatever the language it may be that you're learning, is because when we're learning these words, you might have a lot of words known, but we don't really know how to use them. Or if we know how to use them, we don't know how to use them like a native speaker. So when we speak, it comes off very strange. And the way to fix that, quote unquote, is by making sure that when you're learning words, you're learning them in their context, and you're trying to also memorize phrases in which that word is being used and how natives usually use that word and how it usually comes in the context within which you're going to use it. So that was the third point. The fourth point is that there are three components to knowing a word. There are three components to knowing a word. Its form, meaning its pronunciation and spelling. So in Arabic, for example, I need to learn how the word baytun is spelled, and I also need to learn how it's pronounced. I need to know that the ba has a fatha on it, the ya has a kasra on it, the ta has a fatha on it. So I need to learn the different harakats and how the haraka on a word can change it, right? So one word can have a different meaning based on just you changing one haraka, right? Or one verb, when you're conjugating it, it can change based on you changing a haraka. So when you're learning words specifically in Arabic and any other language, but more specifically in Arabic, you need to learn the form and also the different forms that it may have and how you change the haraka of the word can change its meaning, and how this word with this haraka means this, but with this haraka means something different, and learning that. Then you also need to learn its meaning, or meanings, plural, right? Then after that, you also need to learn its usage or its usages. So its frequency and other words that usually accompany it. So for example, the verb bahatha. The verb bahatha means to search for, but the verb bahatha pretty much always comes with the harf jar an. So you're always usually going to say bahatha an kada. He searched for something, right? And then likewise, to go back to the form, when I learn the verb bahatha, I need to learn its mudari' form. I need to learn that bahatha in the mudari' is yabhathu. So bahatha yabhathu. So you need to learn its form, you need to memorize it, you need to learn its meanings and its different meanings, and you also need to learn its different usages and how to use the words. So again, there's much more to learning a word than you just remembering, okay, the word is this and it means this, but you also need to learn its usage. You also need to make sure that you've mastered its form. So there's always a lot that comes with learning just one word in any language. And that comes with time. This is not something that should be done in one sitting, but rather it's something that you have to keep in the back of your head when you're learning words, that you're going to have to learn its different meanings and its different usages. And this comes with time and with practice and with exposure to the language. So that's point 4. Point 5 is that vocabulary learning is incremental. So this is something that's mentioned by Kev Falls, which is that the single most important aspect of any vocabulary practice activity is not so much what ELL do with the word, but rather the number of times EAL or ELLs interact with the word. So this is an English concept. So English learners, English language learners, that's what's meant here by ELL. What we're trying to make you understand here is that, and this pretty much ties into point 4, which is that, and Kev Falls is a linguistic scholar at the University of Florida, one of the universities in Florida. But he mentioned this here, and what his point here is that the single most important aspect of any vocabulary practice activity, I mean, the single most important aspect when it comes to you learning vocabulary is not so much how many times you see the word, but how you use the word and how you interact with the word. So the more you interact with the word in different ways, and the more deep your level of processing of that word is, the stronger you're going to retain that word, and the better you're going to be able to use that word. So when you're learning vocabulary, you should try to expose yourself to that vocabulary in as much different scenarios or in different abilities or skills. So writing the word down, writing it in a sentence, and then listening to it being spoken in a sentence, and then you saying it in a sentence. All these different levels of processing, all these different interaction that you're having with that word will cement your understanding of it, and will cement and make you better understand what we previously covered in terms of you understanding not only its form and meanings, but also its usages. How will you be able to understand the different meanings and different usages, the different usages of a word? It's by interacting with that word in many different scenarios and in many different ways. And that's what's meant here by vocabulary learning. Vocabulary learning is incremental. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time. So now the question is, how many exposures do I need? How many times should I try to expose myself to a word until I'm more or less certain that I'm going to have understood it? And how many times do I need to expose myself to a word and interact with it for me to sort of have it really quote unquote mastered? So according to Nation's survey of the research, he found the results to be ranging from as little as 5 to 16 or more exposures. So Nation, who has an amazing book on vocabulary learning, he pretty much mentions here that after he surveyed the research, that it varies dramatically. The amount of exposure and the amount of interaction that a learner needs to have with one word, just one word, to really understand and to really have quote unquote mastered it, it can range from 5 to 16 times to more times. So that's what's meant here by learning vocabulary is incremental. Just because you came across a word once and you quote unquote memorize it, doesn't mean that you're not going to forget it. Doesn't mean that you won't have to expose yourself to it many more times in order to be able to use it, appropriately. So learning vocabulary takes time pretty much. Next point is that vocabulary learning requires consolidation. So according to studies, when memorizing new information, most forgetting happens soon after the memorization session. After that initial loss, the rate of forgetting what was memorized begins to decrease. So what's meant here is that when you're learning anything or when you're memorizing any information, pretty much this graph here should help us. When you're learning or when you're memorizing something and you have it memorized, this is how your memory of it is going to function. At the beginning of it, it's right here. but then right afterwards, it drastically goes down. Your memory of that thing and your ability to recall that information drastically goes down. And then if you keep practicing it, or if you practice it and you keep it in you keep recalling it to a certain extent, it's going to start plateauing. Your memory of that word is going to sort of reach a level where you sort of got it now. But that happens much later on. That happens much later on. And right after you've memorized that thing, usually your memory of that thing will start to go down, pretty much. Will start to go down. So pretty much it's something on the lines of this. You've memorized something, it's fresh in your memory. Okay? Then afterwards, you start forgetting that thing. And if you keep working on that thing and you keep recalling that thing, slowly you're going to start remembering it. Slowly you're going to start remembering it, and then it's sort of going to plateau. And that's why, for example, when it comes to people who've memorized the Quran, or people who memorize the Quran in general, usually you realize that what you just memorized is strong, and what you memorized a year ago is also strong. But what you memorized maybe 6 months ago, what you memorized between those two extremes is what's the weakest. The reason why is because what you just memorized is fresh in your memory. And what you memorized a year ago is firmly cemented in your memory. But what you memorized, a few months ago, it's in between. It's in between because it's not fresh, and at the same time, it's not firm and cemented in your memory. So it's in between. So that's sort of what's trying to be said here. So when you're memorizing something, you need to make sure that you expose yourself to it and you recall it and you go over it multiple times. So that's what's meant here. So according to studies, when memorizing new information, most forgetting happens soon after the memorization session. So based on these findings, the principle of expanded rehearsal was developed, which encourages students to review what they have memorized soon after their initial learning session, and then at gradual increasing intervals. So this is how you should try your best to memorize things. And of course, what we're talking about here is vocabulary. So when you've just learned a vocabulary word, or when you just memorized it, you should try to go over it later on in the day, or later on soon, yani not too long afterwards. And then afterwards, you should increase your blocks of intervals between you memorizing it, or you recalling it, or you reviewing it. You should try to make that gradually bigger and bigger and bigger, because as you do that, it's going to start plateauing till you've pretty much got it down. And now let's go on to the next and the final principle. The final principle is that you need to actively use your vocabulary. And this is sort of obvious, but as Norman Segalowitz, if I'm not mistaken, explains, practice that involves, and he's a linguistic scholar in Oxford University, practice that involves dealing with information in a consistent manner and not mere repetition has been demonstrated to be a major factor in determining development of high levels of skill, because it is just at such extensive, consistent practice that leads to automation. Practice makes perfect. To sum it up, practice makes perfect. So you have to not only memorize vocabulary, but then you have to use it. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. It's as simple as that. So you have to make sure that you are actively using your vocabulary. So don't go learning vocabulary that you know you're never going to use. If you're learning a language for a specific context, daily life and stuff like that, you're not going to be using it all the time. You're only going to be using it in certain scenarios. Make sure that you learn vocabulary that you're going to be using in those scenarios, because if you just start learning a bunch of vocabulary that deals with things that you're never going to cover, you're going to forget it because you're not actively using it. And what you don't use, you lose. That's sort of pretty much it. So those are the 7 key principles that should help you in better understanding how you should learn vocabulary, how you should memorize vocabulary, how you should review vocabulary, and the importance of vocabulary learning.